You won't be able to feed your children with this," declared the French central bank's governor, his voice echoing with finality. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. He simply smiled, lifted the new banknotes in his hand, and replied, "On the contrary, with this money, our children will finally know the true value of their own wealth." That day wasn't just about new currency, it was a reckoning. The gold-backed Sankara franc had entered circulation, and with it, the curtain was closing on 60 years of economic colonization. The presidential palace in Burkina Faso was unusually full that morning. Ministers, advisors, central bank officials all summoned for what Traoré called a matter of national sovereignty. No one knew quite what to expect, but the tension was thick. At exactly 9 a.m. he entered, not with fanfare, but with a simple folder in hand, marked with a national emblem. He didn't sit. He stood, and then, in a voice steady but weighted with truth, he spoke. "For 64 years since our so-called independence, we have never controlled our own money. The CFA franc, created by France in 1945 for its colony, still binds us, a currency we don't print, a policy we don't decide. Decisions made not in Ouagadougou but in Paris." He opened the folder and laid it out for all to see, documents outlining the invisible chains, half of Burkina Faso's foreign reserves held in the French treasury, a fixed exchange rate to the euro, no freedom to manage inflation, no power over interest rates. "This," Traoré said, "is not independence. This is economic colonialism with a new name." Finance Minister Kabor, a Sorbonne-educated economist, raised his hand, hesitant. "Mr. President, I agree with your diagnosis, but the CFA also offers stability, predictable trade, low inflation. Ending it could invite serious risks." Traoré nodded, respectfully, thoughtfully. "Indeed, that's the deal. We've been sold surrender, sovereignty, for a sense of calm. But tell me, has that calm ever fed our people? Has 6 decades of so-called stability lifted Burkina Faso from poverty?" The silence in the room answered for them. "We sit atop gold," he continued, "yet remain among the world's poorest. That changes now." He took a breath. "I'm proposing what some will call radical, but I call it long overdue. Burkina Faso will introduce its own sovereign currency, the Sankara franc, named after the leader who first dared to dream true independence." Gasps, whispers, a ripple of disbelief. The central bank governor, Ouedraogo, looked uneasy. "Mr. President, launching a new currency is no small feat. We need reserves, recognition, institutions." Traoré didn't argue, he agreed. "And that's why," he said, "this wouldn't be rushed. Will take 2 years. Phase 1, build gold reserves by nationalizing all mining operations. Phase 2, create an independent monetary authority. Phase 3, print our own currency, fully backed by our gold." Then came the inevitable question, from a quiet but clear voice across the room: "And France? What will their response be?" Traoré's jaw tensed slightly. "There will be resistance, diplomatic, economic. France gains too much from this system: control over 14 nations' currencies. First, access to our resources, billions in profits. They will not let go quietly." The conversation stretched for hours. Technical challenges, legal hurdles, global repercussions. But one truth stood above all others. Monetary sovereignty was not optional anymore. It was the final step toward real freedom. As the room emptied, Traoré asked Governor Ouedraogo to stay behind. Behind closed doors, the president softened. "You have doubts, Governor. I need to hear them." Ouedraogo sighed, the weight of his decades in finance in his voice. "I believe in the vision, Mr. President. But the world is not kind to African nations who challenge the system. They can cut off access to swift downgrade our credit, block our loans, spark capital flight." He paused. "They have tools to punish us, and they will use them." The irony was brutal. They would create the very instability they claimed only they could prevent. Traoré sat quietly, listening. His face gave little away, but his mind was racing. "If we move forward," he finally said, "we must be ready for economic war." Governor Ouedraogo didn't hesitate. "Then we need contingency plans for every possible attack." And just like that, Burkina Faso began to prepare, silently, strategically, in absolute secrecy. A hand-picked team of economists, legal minds, intelligence officials assembled behind closed doors. Their mission wasn't just to launch a currency. It was to build a shield strong enough to protect an entire nation from the wrath of a global financial order. 6 months later, the first crack of daylight appeared. Traoré went public with a bombshell. All foreign mining contracts would be renegotiated. From now on, at least 51% ownership would go to the Burkina state, and 25% of all gold sold directly to the national treasury. No middlemen, no discounts. The world reacted instantly. Mining giants threatened to pull out. The IMF raised alarms. French media called it resource nationalism, a reckless move. They said that would destroy Burkina Faso's economy. Traoré didn't blink. In a national address, he met the outrage head-on. "For decades, foreign companies have taken our gold while our people remained poor. No more. The wealth beneath our soil belongs, first and foremost, to the people of Burkina Faso. Fair partnerships are welcome. Exploitation is not." But behind the scenes, Phase 2 was already underway. a covert network of experts, including sympathetic economists from across Africa and even some from Europe, quietly laid the groundwork. They designed the legal and financial architecture for a new monetary system. State-of-the-art printing facilities were discreetly built, anti-counterfeit security features developed, and most critically, a heavily fortified vault beneath the central bank began filling with gold. Word got out eventually. It always does. 14 months after the first secret meeting, the Financial Times broke the story. Is Burkina Faso planning a CFA exit? Within days, France responded. Finance Minister Jean-Pierre Lair arrived in Ouagadougou demanding an emergency meeting with Traoré in the quiet of the palace. Their conversation was careful but tense. Mr. President, Lair began, France is deeply concerned about these rumors. The CFA system has brought stability for generations. A sudden withdrawal could destabilize not just Burkina Faso but the entire region. Traoré remained respectful but firm. Tell me, Minister, would France ever allow another country to hold 50% of its reserves, to print its money, to control its economy? Lair shifted in his seat. That's not a fair comparison. It is exactly the fair comparison, Traoré replied. What you call stability we've come to see is control. We honor our obligations, but our sovereignty is not negotiable. Lair tried a different approach. Perhaps reforms were possible. Reduced reserve requirements, a bigger voice in policy. Too little, too late. For years we've asked, for years we've been ignored. Now, the time for waiting is over. The meeting ended without agreement, but not without consequences. Within 48 hours, the financial pressure began. Credit ratings downgraded. French banks suspended cooperation with Burkinab institutions. Transactions grew harder, slower, more expensive. Rumors spread like wildfire. Devaluation, collapse, fear. Wealthy elites rushed to convert CFA francs into euros and dollars. Banks saw lines forming. Quiet panic was setting in. It was time. 18 months after the secret plan began, 6 months ahead of schedule, Traoré stepped in front of the nation. The camera was rolling, the flag behind him, his voice steady. Citizens of Burkina Faso, today, I announce a step many said was impossible. On July 15th, 1 month from today, our nation will introduce its own sovereign currency, the Sankara franc. No turning back now. The plan was bold. The Sankara franc would circulate alongside the CFA for 6 months. A careful transition, not chaos. Each note backed by gold, each bill redeemable for its weight in real, physical reserves stored beneath the central bank. And for stability, a fixed 1-to-1 exchange rate with the CFA. No shocks, no overnight collapse, just a clean break on their own terms. But as President Traoré made clear, this wasn't just a swap of currency. This was not about changing paper, he told the nation. This is about reclaiming the soul of our economy, our right to decide our own future. The world responded, and not kindly. France especially was swift to dismiss it. Michel Dupont, governor of the French central bank, scoffed on international radio. The so-called sovereign currency is political theater. Burkina Faso won't be able to feed its children with these fantasy bills. When that quote reached Traoré during a press conference, he didn't argue. He simply held up the new note, Thomas Sankara's face on one side, Burkinab gold miners on the other. A soft smile crossed his face. On the contrary, he said, with this money, our children will finally see the true value of their own wealth. That moment went viral. As launch day neared, excitement pulsed across the country, tinged with anxiety. Markets, schools, and village squares buzzed with information campaigns. Bank staff trained for double currency operations. Security forces increased patrols to guard against sabotage. But then, 5 days before the launch, the real test came. The IMF pulled the plug on a $150 million loan. Simultaneously, several global banks froze ties with Burkina Faso, cutting it off from international finance. The pressure was real, but Traoré's team, ready months earlier, they had laid the groundwork for exactly this moment. Backup plans activated new banking routes through allies like Ghana, Algeria, Russia, and China. Currency swap deals kicked in, ensuring vital supplies, fuel, flowing, and quietly. A few neighboring CFA countries began reaching out, supportive, curious, watching if Burkina Faso pulls this off. One official said privately, we might just be next. Then came July 15th. The capital stood still. In Independence Square, thousands gathered as the sun rose behind a new flag of purpose. President Traoré stepped forward and made history. He bought a basket of produced fresh local Burkinab with a crisp Sankara franc. Not a currency bearing European architecture, but one marked with the faces and places that told their story. Today, he declared, our money reflects our values, our resources, our sovereignty. For the first time since colonial rule, we decide what our economy stands for. The crowd erupted. And yet, beneath the celebration, the hard work had just begun. There were hiccups. Some merchants hesitated to accept the new notes. Rural areas faced delays. Foreign businesses demanded a premium to deal in Sankara francs. But the apocalypse Western pundits had forecast never came. Inflation modest. Bank runs faded, confidence growing, and something unexpected began to rise. The wave of economic pride. a drive to buy local, to build, to believe. Import dependency dropped. Domestic production surged. 3 months in, the country faced its first real challenge. A drought hit key agricultural regions. Food prices teetered under the old CFA regime. Solutions would have come from Paris. Delayed, conditional, restricted. But now, with their own currency and their own central bank, Burkina Faso acted fast. Targeted liquidity programs supported struggling farmers. Markets stabilized. Prices held. They had passed the test. 6 months after the launch, as the transition period came to a close, one thing was clear: Burkina Faso had not just changed its currency, it had claimed its future. The old currency, the CF, now fully phased out, and the world was watching. What many had called a reckless gamble was slowly turning into a regional awakening. Bloomberg published a headline that said it all. Against all odds, how Burkina Faso's currency gamble is paying off. They pointed to one key factor: gold, a timeless metal, now backing a modern revolution. That gold gave the people something they'd never had in their currency before: trust. But the impact wasn't just financial, it was political, cultural, continental. Soon, delegations from Mali and Niger nations with similar colonial pasts came knocking. They weren't just curious, they were inspired. Discussions began not just about leaving the CFA but about something far bigger: a new regional currency, controlled by Africans themselves, not dictated from Paris. Exactly 1 year after the Sankara franc entered circulation, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a summit of West African leaders in Ouagadougou. The theme was bold: monetary sovereignty for the entire region. What we've proven, Traoré said, looking his fellow presidents in the eye, is that the choice between sovereignty and stability is a false one. With proper planning, strong institutions, and real reserves, we can have both. We can control our money and ensure economic predictability. Meanwhile, France, the same France that had once dismissed the Sankara franc as doomed to fail, was shifting its tone. President Martel extended a public olive branch, a reformed partnership, more autonomy, a revamped CFA, but Traoré's reply was calm and firm: we welcome your willingness to discuss reforms. Reforms our people had been denied for 60 years until we took action ourselves. But Burkina Faso will not return to any system where our monetary policy is decided outside our borders. We're open to regional cooperation, but only as equals, with sovereignty at the foundation. And the numbers told a story no one could deny. 18 months after the transition, Burkina Faso's economy was growing at 5.2%, 2 points higher than during the CFA years. Inflation, a steady 4%, defying the apocalyptic forecasts from Western economists. But the biggest change wasn't on paper. Poverty rates were falling because, for the first time, monetary policy was tailored for Burkinab needs, not foreign markets. Even the gold standard, once mocked as outdated, proved crucial. People who never trusted paper money began to believe, because they knew, if needed, this currency could be turned into real gold, real value, real power. As trust grew, the gold reserves didn't have to carry the full weight. The confidence itself became the foundation. 2 years after the launch, Traoré made a bold move. He invited journalists from around the world to see the national gold vault beneath the central bank, under heavy guard. The cameras captured it: stacks of gold bars, each stamped with Burkina Faso's emblem. This isn't just a reserve, Traoré told them. It's a statement. For decades, our gold was stripped away, sold abroad, enriching others. Now it secures our future. Now it's the spine of our sovereignty. And slowly the tone across the world began to shift. The very institutions that once laughed at this idea were now studying it. Harvard economists published papers analyzing the Burkina model. Even the IMF, once openly critical, quietly acknowledged the truth: with proper reserves, national currencies can offer greater policy flexibility, sometimes more than what rigid currency unions allow. But perhaps the most powerful endorsement came not from experts but from the people themselves. Asha Odrago, a market vendor in Ouagadougou, said it best: before, our money had faces we didn't know, buildings we'd never seen. It didn't feel like ours. But now, when I hold a note with Sankara's face, with our landmarks, I feel pride. And when I know it's backed by our gold, I feel safe. For Ibrahim Traoré, the Sankara franc was never just about money. It was a mirror, a symbol, a declaration. In a quiet moment, during an anniversary interview, he reflected: monetary sovereignty isn't just for bankers and economists, it's about who writes the rules of your life. Because when others control your money, they control your hospitals, your schools, your roads, your future. Reclaiming our currency was reclaiming our destiny. In just a few years, what began as a bold experiment had become something bigger: a symbol. 3 years after its launch, the Sankara franc wasn't just Burkina Faso's currency anymore. It was a banner for a movement to African monetary independence that was echoing far beyond its borders. One by one, neighboring countries followed. 5 West African nations began their own journey away from the CFA, carving a new path toward a shared dream, a currency union not rooted in old colonial frameworks, but in mutual respect, sovereignty, and African cooperation. France couldn't ignore the shifting ground beneath its feet, faced with the momentum they once dismissed. They offered long overdue reforms, reducing reserve requirements, promising African voices a greater say in monetary decisions. But by then, the tide had already turned. Burkina Faso had changed the game. 4 years after that first tense meeting in the presidential palace, when uncertainty loomed and the world doubted, President Ibrahim Traoré brought his economic team back together. But this time, there was no crisis. This time, they gathered to celebrate. The currency many had expected to collapse in months had not only survived, it had flourished. "We've proven we can manage our own money," Traoré told them. "Now it's time to use it to build what we've always deserved: prosperity." The next phase was clear: to turn sovereignty into solutions. That meant using the COLONIal franc to support what really mattered: farmers, teachers, engineers, builders, to invest in agriculture, clean energy, technology, and education, while still guarding the discipline that kept their economy stable. They also began to scale back the gold reserve backing, not because it had failed, but because the people now trusted the system enough to let those gold bars do more than sit in a vault. They could now fuel the economy, and the vision didn't stop at the border. Burkina Faso began working with other African nations to build something larger: a regional currency system, designed by Africans, for Africans, not dictated from outside but grown from the inside out. 5 years in, the COLONIal franc was more than currency. It was a case study, a living example. International finance textbooks carried its story, African universities dissected its strategy, and even European economists began to admit what was once unthinkable: the CFA system was no longer sustainable in a world where former colonies demanded real independence. But perhaps the greatest transformation wasn't in the numbers or the policies. It was in the hearts of ordinary Burkinab. Ask someone like Asha Adrago, a vendor in Ouagadougou's bustling markets. She once viewed the new currency with fear, now she holds it with pride. Before, she said, our money had faces we didn't know, buildings we'd never seen. But now it shows our heroes, our stories, and it's backed by our gold. I feel pride, I feel safe. For President Traoré, this journey was never just about economics. It was about ownership, about deciding your own fate. In an emotional interview on the 5th anniversary, he said it plainly: money is just a tool. What matters is who holds it and what they use it for. Today our money serves our people, our growth, our future. That's what true independence means. The COLONIal franc had started as a rebellion against a broken system. But it became something far greater, a model for how resource-rich nations could break free, not by waiting for permission, but by writing their own rules. As more African nations adapted the model in their own way, a new pattern began to take shape across the continent, one built not on dependency, but on dignity. The prediction once made by the French central bank that the Burkinab wouldn't be able to feed their children with this new money had aged poorly, because with monetary sovereignty, Burkina Faso fed more than stomachs. It fed hope. It built schools, it fixed roads, it reached rural clinics, it gave the nation power to solve its own problems, on its own terms, and in the end, that's what the COLONIal franc came to symbolize. Not just economic freedom, but the right to dream, to decide, and to build without asking permission. It didn't just change their currency, it changed their future.